NBC celebrates America with a special program saluting the bicentennial year.
Welcome to Knowledge, a series of programs that examines the role played by the Army in the overall development of America. Now, here is your host, Guy DiCarlo.
Hello, and welcome to the 9th program of the Knowledge Series, The Army and America. July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, will live in the annals of our Army's history. The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest military event ever to take place in the United States up to this time. It involved approximately 150,000 Union and Confederate soldiers, of which 51,000 either lost their lives or were wounded during the three-day Holocaust. To help us relive the three tragic days is our guest, Dr. Callahan, oral surgeon, past president of the Civil War Roundtable of Cleveland, member of the Western Reserve and National Historical Societies. Ken, where should we begin our talk on the Battle of Gettysburg?
Well, in order to understand the Gettysburg battle, Guy, we should begin with an overview of the Gettysburg campaign and the routes which the two armies took in order to reach their bloody rendezvous, which took place up in Pennsylvania. This first map represents a segment of the eastern middle seaboard states. The north end of the map represents Pennsylvania.
Slow.
Middle portion of the map represents Maryland, and the south portion of the map represents Northern Virginia. The mountain range, which you see here, is the Blue Ridge Mountains. Beyond it is the Shenandoah Valley, and in the valley is the Shenandoah River, which flows to its confluence with the Potomac River, which then continues on beyond Washington, D.C. to form its estuary. In May of 1863, two vast armies, Union and Confederate, faced each other on the Rappahannock Line in Northern Virginia. Then General Lee took his Confederate army, turned his shoulder contemptuously on its opponent, and moved up towards Culpeper, Virginia. Indeed, the invasion of the North had begun. It was the young nation's supreme thrust at the ominous face, which were rapidly closing in about it. General Lee's immediate objective was the division of the enemy's supply route up in Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. He might then cut his arterial supply line across the Susquehanna River, perhaps move down, fight a battle someplace in the vicinity of Gettysburg in middle Pennsylvania, and being victorious, he hoped he would then move down, capture Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and then return back to Northern Virginia. General Lee's Confederate Army was high-stomached and confident that spring, and they swung up out of Dixie with an elastic step. They moved forward towards the Blue Ridge Mountains, and on June the 6th, they crossed the mountain gap through the Blue Ridge and moved rapidly down the Shenandoah Valley. One by one, the United States telegraph stations in the advance of the tide of the Confederate Army became ominously silent. And then suddenly, on June the 10th, Lee's army fell full force on a Union garrison in Winchester, Virginia. They captured the garrison and they sounded the thunderclap in the valley. The gateway to the north has been swung open. The devil is loose, and he's coming north. 2 days later, Confederate advance cavalry was parading up Main Street in Hagerstown in Maryland. By the next day, they were up into Chambersburg in Pennsylvania. They had finally entered Yankee country. Meanwhile, the Union Army began to wonder what had become of General Lee's Confederate Army, and they sent scouts out. Cavalry scouts went out and at the Battle of Brandy Station ran into the Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart. They fought a spirited battle. Union cavalry drove Stuart from the field and then returned back to Union Army headquarters to report the disquieting news that General Lee was no longer on his front, but rather was moving forth via the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania. The Union Army then tried to swing an inside arc. They tried to protect the nation's capital, and they moved belatedly by forced marches. They crossed the Potomac and moved into the little towns of Maryland, Frederick, Taneytown, and Emmitsburg. Two armies are moving obliquely towards a bloody rendezvous and history is about to unfold. General Lee's advanced Confederate Army, up in Chambersburg, with nothing before them and nothing to slow them, moved down the Chambersburg Pike towards the little town of Gettysburg. There they took on supplies and moved out to the little town of York in Pennsylvania. They had high hopes of crossing the bridge over the Susquehanna River and capturing Harrisburg. Finding the bridge burned, they fell back and encamped at York. Another segment of Ewell's advanced Confederate Army encamped at Carlisle, northwest of Gettysburg. The rest of the Confederate Army was now completely up. They were in the general area of Chambersburg. General Lee was now concerned over the fact that he did not know exactly where the Union Army was, and this is because he simply was out of touch with his Confederate cavalry. Jeb Stuart had become lost down in Virginia, and Lee was now blind in the enemy's land. He was further concerned over the fact that his own army spread out too far. They spread from York to Carlisle to Chambersburg. This is a total distance of 70 miles. Now concerned that his own army was spread out too far, he decided to pull in the strings. He sent orders to his army to concentrate on the little town of Gettysburg. So, Ewell's Confederate advanced divisions are moving down from Carlisle, and they're moving down from Gettysburg, from York. These two armies are all converging on this little college hamlet called Gettysburg. And there, by some strange coincidence, the advance of the Union Army is about to stumble into them. This latter army, now under the command of General Meade, is moving up through Maryland and approaching the town of Gettysburg. He is spread out also, but at least he has functional cavalry. So Lee, the Southern Army, is approaching the town of Gettysburg, paradoxically, from the north, and the Union Army is approaching Gettysburg from the south. Now, in order to understand the battle, I want you to consider that we're going to take a little segment of the battlefield right here, just the size of a playing card, and we're going to expand that into a larger battle map. You see? We're going to take this segment right here. We know that the Confederate Army is coming in from the northwest, from the northeast, and from the north. And the Union Army is coming in from the south. Now, this then is that playing card size model of the Gettysburg campaign, expanded. So here's the town of Gettysburg. Indeed, here is the town of Gettysburg itself. Here is Cemetery Hill, going down to Cemetery Ridge, to Little Round Top, to Big Round Top, Culp's Hill over here. These were Union positions. The Confederate position is along here, along the Seminary Ridge, and the Confederate Army, the advance, is going to be coming in over the Chambersburg Pike. Now, we know that any army that wants to fight here, if they are a Union Army, ought to think about the fact that there are Union troops, Confederate troops coming down from the northeast, from the north, and from the northwest.
Okay, Ken, then should we start the Battle of Gettysburg then proper?
Let's begin with the Confederate Army moving down the Chambersburg Pike. On the morning of June the 30th, some Virginia troops of Hill's Corps moved down the Chambersburg Pike towards the little village of Gettysburg. There they hoped to buy shoes for their barefoot soldiers. As the division approached the town, they ran headlong into the Union Army as a Union Blue cavalry column rode towards the village square from Emmitsburg. The Confederate troops fell back immediately and notified General Hill. Hill insisted that these soldiers could not possibly be the advance of the Union Army. They were probably the home guard and the local militia. He told his men to go out and take the town the following morning. But some Confederate veterans noted ominously that those horse soldiers out there wore the broad black sombrero hats that marked the Army of the Potomac. The Union cavalry commander, of course, realized that he had stumbled into a Confederate hornet's nest. He had touched the point of Lee's spearhead, and he advised General Meade to hurry up infantry support. General Meade, in turn, directed him to go out, dismount, and take possession of the Chambersburg Pike. At dawn on the morning of July the 1st, a division of Hill's Confederate Corps moved upon Gettysburg. It was only 5:30 in the morning, and the day was already unbearably hot. As the rebels attempted to ford a little stream, there was a sudden spattering of musket fire as the dismounted Union cavalry opened upon them. The rebels fell back, reformed, and then returned the fire. They called for infantry support. and the battle was on. The Union boys were suddenly in deep trouble, and they called for infantry support themselves. General Reynolds immediately directed his First Corps, moving up the highway from the south, to double quick across the field, take possession on the Union right, and open fire. He placed his famous Iron Brigade up front. By 10 o'clock, the Confederate advance had been checked, and General Reynolds was dead upon the field. But more Union help was on its way. General Howard brought the advance of his 11th Corps of Ohio and New York troops up around noon and placed them on the Union right to extend north. This patently foolish move placed his troops open on the right flank and rear to attack by Ewell's Confederates, who were known to be advancing at top speed toward their flank from Carlisle and York. Yet Howard allowed his troops to remain in place until enemy troops struck him on flank. General Lee, who did not want to fight here, arrived on the scene at about 1 o'clock. He saw that the conflict was now raging out of control, and he took command. At about the same time, he heard the welcome sound of Southern guns over on his left. It was a division of Ewell's Corps coming down from Carlisle in full force. They fell upon the open Union right flank. The Union Army was now in severe jeopardy, inasmuch as they were engaged in the task of holding their front and trying to protect their flank. But the Confederate attack was made in piecemeal at first, and Howard was able to prolong his line to support the assault. The battle was still in balance. At about 3 o'clock, the arrival of the rest of Ewell's Confederate Corps, coming down from York, brought enormous force against the flank of Howard's Union line, and it began to crack under the crossfire. Now, a North Carolina division, held in support, suddenly moved up a quarter of a mile out on the Union left flank, and Lee ordered a combined offense along the whole Confederate line. The Union line began to fall back through the town in some confusion and then in great panic. The survivors scrambled towards Gettysburg, through the town, toward the high ground on Cemetery Hill, and there they held on. The Union line had cracked, and the dead were scattered everywhere. Southern troops proceeded to occupy the town and capture 5,000 terrified Union prisoners. With its flank uncovered, the Union line became untenable. Lee now struck hard from left and right and drove the Northerners back in a rout toward the high ground of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. There they reformed and brought their artillery to bear. They left their dead scattered on the field in windrows. The victorious Confederates moved forward and south. They secured the Chambersburg Pike. They then took possession of the Seminary Ridge. General Ewell, who occupied Gettysburg, was now in an excellent position to complete the rout of the battered Union Army, which was desperately scrambling to get their ordnance on high ground. But Ewell felt that his troops were spent, and by the time a fresh rebel division was brought up below Culp's Hill, it was 9:30 at night, and the first day was over. In their great age, how many of those Confederate veterans would look back on that hot afternoon in July when the war indeed seemed to be almost won? The Confederate generals met that evening in a vineyard near the Lutheran Seminary. Lee immediately directed the rest of Hill's Corps to be strung out south along the Seminary Ridge. Lee then proposed that the Confederate Army continue to carry the offensive on the second day by attacking the Union left. General Longstreet violently opposed the idea, but Lee's answer was blunt. He said, "No, the enemy is out there, and I shall attack him where he is." Straight across the valley and just south of the town, the cemetery is crowned with a rustic stone gate. There at midnight on July the 1st, General Meade, Union Army commander, confers with his chiefs. He has just arrived on the field, and some of the news is bad. 2 of his Army Corps, Reynolds and Howard, are in tatters. Of the 18,000 Union soldiers who fought that morning, only 6,000 are still standing. Reynolds is dead, and his famous Iron Brigade is virtually annihilated. But some of the news is good. Remnants of the 2 corps are dug in on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, and the Union holds the high ground. Meade wisely orders the wagon trains and the teamsters and the infantry to keep rolling all through the night. Under a full moon, fresh reinforcements are being poured into the line. Meade will stand and fight here on this ground, and now. He is bringing up the Army of the Potomac. Fresh troops are placed between the hills. New artillery support is sent forward to Cemetery Hill, and Hancock's 2nd Corps is deployed along the Cemetery Ridge. To their left, General Sickles locks his 3rd Corps into position with his left to rest on Little Round Top. By morning, Meade has consolidated his line on elevated ground with his right on Culp's Hill, his center on Cemetery Ridge, and his left on Little Round Top. His position is good and easily accessible to inside lines. It is only 4 miles long. After dawn, General Sykes brings up his 5th Corps reserves. They have been in marching columns for 24 hours, and they are allowed to bivouac on the highway. General Sedgwick's 6th Corps, the last troops up, were still on the road that night. July the 2nd dawned hot and unpleasant, and it found General Longstreet the same way. His troops were badly scattered. By the time his 2 divisions had breakfasted, formed column, and marched down Seminary Ridge to the right of the line on the Emmetsburg Road, it was 11:30 in the morning. More hours were lost, while the terrain was reconnoitered, and it was found that the Union left flank was not open to attack, as Lee had supposed, but instead was refused and strongly posted on Little Round Top. Finally, Longstreet's Confederates were in position on the right. Hood's Texans, the finest shock troops in the Confederate Army, took their place, faced north, and prepared to charge. The Texans were ordered by Longstreet to wheel to the north along the Emmetsburg Road and strike the Union left. Over on the Union side, General Sickles' 3rd Corps constituted the Union left. Sickles, the agitator, was dissatisfied with his position in the valley. He suddenly took it upon himself to make a change. He moved his right flank forward along the Emmetsburg Road and joined it at the Peach Orchard with his left flank, which was then rolled out to touch the Devil's Den. This new line left a wide gap in the Union line, and worse, it left Little Round Top unprotected. On the other hand, it presented an angle to the enemy. Longstreet's Confederate attack therefore fell not upon an open flank, as he had hoped for, but as a deadly frontal assault on an organized salient. As the Texans advanced towards Devil's Den, they were suddenly caught in a withering burst of fire. They fell back, reformed, and charged again. Now Confederate cannon opened and point blank across the Emmetsburg Road into the Union line. The Union advance line crumbles and melts away. Reinforcements of the 5th Corps, held in reserve, are charging across the valley to reinforce the Union right. The Texans capture Devil's Den in the wheat field, and the Mississippi Regiment is driving the Yankees from the Peach Orchard. The struggle is of a terrible nature, fought 10 yards apart, with handspikes and fists and gun rammers. While this struggle is taking place, General Longstreet observes that Little Round Top, the key to the Union line, is unoccupied. He orders brigades to charge double quick up the south side and take the hill. But a Union signal officer realizes the importance of the hill and takes the responsibility for its defense. He intercepts reserve units and tells them to take position on Little Round Top. In a matter of seconds, the Texans are charging the slopes with fixed bayonets. Halfway up, they are met with a galling fire as the freshly formed Union troops open upon them from between the rocks. Unable to face the storm, the rebels fall back to the base. Reinforced, they assault the north slope, but a little nest of Maine lumberjacks rain such death into their ranks that they are cut down in their tracks. Little Round Top will remain in Union hands. Around the Peach Orchard and the wheat field, the fighting rages. Finally, Longstreet sends 6 brigades into the thinning Union line. The remnants of the Union advanced salient collapses. They fall back, fighting like tigers, leaving half of their command dead upon the field, and return to Cemetery Ridge, their original line. The Union line has been hammered into solidarity. Longstreet's Confederates have fought all evening at a terrible cost of lives for nothing more than a few acres of wheat and a peach grove. In darkness and despair, the second day has come to a close. The final day at Gettysburg began at 3:30 in the morning of July the 3rd, when the Confederate left made a final try at the Union right wing in Culp's Hill. They advanced to the foot of the hill and were met quickly by massive ordnance fire as the Union gunners, who had had 2 days to dig in, found their range. The Confederates charged halfway up the slope and fell back with a frightful casualty loss. The famous Louisiana Tigers advanced 1,700 strong and returned with less than 300 men. The rebel left was effectively checked, and the Union fishhook line was still intact. Now, General Lee began making preparations for his assault. He ordered the artillerymen to wheel up 150 cannon along the Confederate front. At 1 o'clock, Lee's cannon opened with a tremendous barrage of missiles. For almost 2 hours, the field trembled with the thundering sounds of shells. It remains to this day the most severe artillery barrage ever effected on the North American continent. The ground shook under the concussion of the cannon. 15 caissons were exploded along the Union line, knocking down many horses, some soldiers, and very few guns. The infantry brigades stood as motionless as the rocks that sheltered them, in the conviction that this cannonade was only a preface. Now General Lee, acting on the mistaken belief that his cannon fire had destroyed the Union guns along Cemetery Ridge, now prepared for his massive infantry assault. The Confederate Army is going in for the knockout. This will be the punch up under the heart, the telling blow of the war which will blind and paralyze the Union Army. He will break the Union center, and now. The artillery cannonade ceases as abruptly as it started, and an anxious and oppressive silence suddenly falls upon the field. It is intensified by the blazing July sun. The low ground between the ridges will shortly become a stage in a giant amphitheater where 150,000 people will observe the final act, where in the 19th century turns on the balance. It is 2:30, and it is ominously quiet. And suddenly the storming gray Confederate columns begin to roll forward out of the woods, with the red battle flag snapping before them. Pickett's charge is in motion, and with it go the hopes and hearts of an infant nation. By shouts and whispers, the word is passed along the Union line, from Culp's Hill to the Round Tops. Here they come out of the woods. 15,000 men, 10 brigades are rolling forth from the ridge. The flower of Lee's army is marching headlong into a legend. Down the gentle ramp they trot, shoulder to shoulder, in a gallant act of archaic chivalry. They had, recalled one veteran, a complete conviction of invincibility. Pickett's division of Longstreet is the spearhead in the first line, and a Virginia brigade is in the second line. To their left, another Virginia division is held in support, and then along the ridge comes reinforcements from Hill's Corps. Brigades from Georgia and Alabama in the deep south. To Pickett's right are 2 more brigades of Hill's Corps. The total attacking force of 15,000 men is almost a mile long, and it is moving with precision and confidence. Halfway down the slope, the advancing line is suddenly struck with the galling fire as 71 Union batteries open solid shot and shell upon the closed ranks. Now the cannon are tearing gaps into the rapidly moving Confederate columns. These gaps are closed by convergence as the columns reach the Emmitsburg Road, where the post rail fencing must be crossed. Union guns never stop shooting them down. Pickett's Confederate charge continues forward, up the hill into the face of an incessant rain of death. Now Pickett makes an oblique movement to the left to reach the base of the ridge, and suddenly the Confederates are charging forward toward the stone wall and towards the clump of trees. Now Pickett opens fire at close range, and out of the smoke comes the second Confederate column in support to open up point blank into the Union troops in the bitter struggle for the bloody angle. Now they are charging with a rebel yell into the face of double canister fire at 10 yards. The advance line crumbles, falls, reforms, and charges again. And at last, the waiting Federal infantry rises and opens upon them from behind the stone wall. And the whole Union line is suddenly lit up with a solid sheet of flame. When the smoke is cleared, Pickett's division is gone. It has melted away. The depleted second line closes in. With old General Armstead in the lead, they leap the stone wall, rush the Union gunners, and wave the rebel flags triumphantly inside the Union lines. But the Union soldiers, forced briefly from the angle, come back in strength. General Meade now pushes forward all of his Ohio and New York reserves, who storm and engulf the disorganized Confederate fragments and blast into their ranks. Seeing how useless further effort would be, those who are able lay down their arms and surrender. Scattered remnants of the great columns are retreating suddenly in groups of 2 and 3 back across the field, which is now strewn with the bodies of their comrades. The 2 brigades of Hill's Corps, who had failed to conform to Pickett's oblique movement to the left, opened a wide gap between themselves and Pickett. They stagger and drift straight toward the Union line in front of Sickles, where the Union cannon batteries unleash such a withering barrage that these divisions are literally wiped out in a matter of minutes. The force of the attacking columns is spent and their power broken. It all happened too fast to have happened at all. In Pickett's division alone, only 1 of every 6 young men who marched forward would return. Out of 15 field officers and 4 generals, only Pickett and 1 lieutenant colonel would survive. The high tide of the Confederacy has swept to its crest, paused, and receded. Now it is ebbing back to the sound of General Lee's own regretful words. "It is all my fault," he says, because he is a man of epic proportions. A warm, steady rain started to fall that evening and continued on the next day, July the 4th, soaking the bodies of the dead and the wounded. Then quietly, General Lee's army began its withdrawal from the field. By companies and brigades and divisions, the Army of Northern Virginia disappeared off Meade's front and rode south to cross the Potomac at high water and escape to safety back in Virginia. There they would huddle around Richmond for 2 tragic years and drag out a brutal war which could have only one ending. But regardless of the controversies which were raised about the judgments and tactics of his superior officers, the Gettysburg campaign still remains an act of epic heroism for the individual fighting soldier. And the men who fought in it marched straight into a legend which will live with Americans as long as they are able to trace their heritage.